What if the trait you were taught to admire most is the very habit that keeps you powerless? If fairness were a story we tell children, but adults compete under different rules, how would that change the way you interpret every slight promotion and public performance of virtue? Today we examine power not as myth, but as measurable behavior. The uncomfortable truth is that social hierarchies rarely reward intelligence in isolation. They reward influence, which is the capacity to shape perceptions, incentives, and outcomes in your environment. People you perceive as less capable may advance because they are better at managing attention, asymmetries of information, and the cost structures that govern cooperation. This is not a moral endorsement of ruthlessness. It is a recognition that human systems are not courts of perfect justice, but marketplaces of perceived value, where status signals narrative framing and credible commitments matter. Machiavelli's enduring relevance is methodological, not mystical. He observed that power concentrates around those who understand human psychology and act decisively under uncertainty. In modern terms, that means 3 pillars. First, emotional sovereignty, or the ability to notice emotion without letting it dictate action. Second, reputation management, or curating the cues by which others infer your competence and intentions. Third, incentive design or structuring. Predictable consequences so that respect becomes the rational choice for others, not a favor you must constantly request. Consider justice as a psychological heuristic. Expecting reciprocity in every interaction is pro-social, but in competitive arenas it becomes a strategic liability. When you behave as though fairness is guaranteed, you telegraph predictability. Predictability invites exploitation by actors who optimize for advantage rather than mutuality. The corrective is not cruelty. The corrective is strategic ambiguity around your boundaries and a credible enforcement mechanism when those boundaries are violated. Emotional sovereignty is the base layer. Reactivity is legible and therefore exploitable. Individuals who broadcast anger injury or the hunger for approval surrender control over pacing and framing to their adversaries. By contrast, disciplined responders treat feelings as data. They ask a single instrumental question before moving. Which response most advances my position while minimizing downstream conflict? This is not coldness, it is calibration. It removes the performance of outrage and replaces it with proportionate singular actions that close the loop rather than elongate drama. Reputation is your public balance sheet. Most observers will never audit your character. They will sample a few salient signals. Posture timing association, narrative consistency, and selective disclosure create a perceived profile of strength or softness. Being authentic is not a license for strategic negligence. The expert stance is to align real strengths with visible signals, limit unnecessary transparency that arms detractors, and ensure that your rare public corrections are precise, calmly delivered, and memorable. Finally, incentives. Arguing for respect is low leverage. Designing environments where reliability earns access and disrespect predictably reduces opportunity is high leverage. When consequences become procedural rather than personal, you lower the surface area for manipulation. People adapt to systems more readily than the central paradox of human interaction is that most people seek to be liked. Yet those who command the most influence are not those who are most agreeable, but those whose presence imposes caution. Machiavelli argued it is safer to be feared than loved when only one can be chosen. Translated into modern psychology, this does not mean cruelty. It means cultivating a reputation that makes others anticipate costs before crossing your boundaries. Respect emerges not from constant pleas for consideration, but from consistent demonstrations that your standards are non-negotiable. To understand this dynamic, we must analyze the mechanics of status. Social dominance theory shows that hierarchies stabilize when members believe consequences are real. If you issue threats, you never enforce, your credibility erodes. If you announce rules but fail to maintain them, others quickly learn they can ignore you. This is why decisive, disproportionate action at the right moment creates a lasting deterrent. One well-chosen response to disrespect is more effective than a dozen verbal reminders. The lesson is etched not through repetition but through impact. Consider a workplace example. An employee repeatedly interrupts you in meetings. You have asked politely before, yet the behavior continues. A weak approach is to complain to colleagues, reinforcing your frustration but not altering incentives. A strong approach is to prepare data, wait for the right meeting, and then calmly expose the interruption in a way that embarrasses the behavior, not the person. The message becomes systemic. This action has a cost. You need not repeat it because the audience now understands the structure. Authority in this form is less about dominance and more about predictability of outcome. Emotional regulation is the second axis of dominance. Neuroscience supports this. The amygdala triggers fight or flight responses, but individuals with higher prefrontal regulation respond strategically rather than impulsively. In competitive environments, those who maintain composure exert subtle control over pacing. An outburst validates the aggressor's frame. A calm, timed response reframes the encounter in your favor. This is why emotionally reactive individuals rarely sustain influence. They are predictable targets, easy to provoke and easy to manipulate. Reputation management must also be understood as applied social cognition. People do not have the cognitive bandwidth to analyze every peer in depth. Instead, they rely on heuristics, posture, tone, attire, associations, and the narratives circulating around you. If you do not curate these signals, others will fill the vacuum with their own interpretations, often unfavorable. A deliberate professional manages not only what is true, but also how it is perceived. This does not require dishonesty. It requires strategic disclosure, selective emphasis, and control of first impressions. As Machiavelli observed, everyone sees what you appear to be. Few experience what you truly are. The final point is discipline. Ruthlessness in its expert definition is not rage but restraint. It is the refusal to allow sentimentality to override rational interest. It is the cold patience to let an opponent overextend while you conserve resources for a single calculated strike. In social dynamics, the most formidable actors are rarely loud. They are deliberate, silent observers positioning themselves until intervention becomes inevitable and decisive. One of the most counterintuitive realities in human interaction is that being agreeable often undermines respect. Social psychology research on compliance shows that agreeable individuals are more likely to be taken for granted because their behavior is predictable and low cost to exploit. In contrast, those who project clear boundaries, who say no without apology, are coded by others as higher status. This transition from seeking approval to commanding it marks the difference between being socially convenient and socially consequential. The principle here is straightforward. Liking is fragile. Respect is durable. When others simply like you, they assume you will forgive slights. When they respect you, they anticipate consequences. This does not mean adopting hostility as your default. It means cultivating a posture of selective engagement. People must learn that your attention is scarce, that your agreement is earned, not given. By rationing your availability and enforcing standards, you reorient relationships so that others compete for your regard rather than the reverse. Machiavelli emphasized that a ruler must be both lion and fox. The lion symbolizes visible strength. The fox symbolizes discretion and strategic foresight. In practice, this duality means balancing assertive displays of authority with subtle manipulation of perception. Too much aggression invites resistance. Too much subtlety invites dismissal. The synthesis, calculated strength, underpinned by strategic ambiguity, creates an aura of authority that feels both formidable and difficult to contest. The mechanics of this can be seen in everyday scenarios. Imagine two managers. The first constantly seeks consensus, over-explains decisions, and apologizes for imposing demands. The second communicates decisions, directly explains rationale briefly when necessary, and then moves forward without inviting endless debate. The first appears accommodating but weak. The second projects certainty, which in turn generates compliance. Over time, subordinates begin to interpret the second manager's approval as valuable, even if they disagree with the content. Authority emerges not from the decision itself, but from the clarity and decisiveness with which it is expressed. Psychological dominance is not about cruelty. It is about engineering the perception that your boundaries are unassailable. You achieve this through decisive action. When disrespect appears, you respond not with drawn-out negotiations, but with a single proportionate demonstration that makes future violations unappealing. This transforms your presence into a variable others must account for in their calculations. In strategic terms, you increase the perceived cost of challenging you and lower the incentive to ignore your interests. Perception control magnifies this effect. Reputation is essentially narrative capital. Others form beliefs about you through stories, signals, and associations. If you do not actively shape these stories, they will be written by competitors. Strategic actors learn to highlight strengths, frame setbacks as lessons, and present themselves with consistency. This does not mean fabricating an image. It means ensuring the interpretation of your actions aligns with your goals. A mistake framed as learning demonstrates resilience. The same mistake framed by others may be seen as incompetence. The difference lies in narrative control. This principle scales beyond individuals. Organizations that master perception management dominate markets not only by performance but also by controlling how that performance is framed. Apple, for instance, has often controlled narratives around product flaws by reframing them as features or by diverting attention to broader visions. The lesson applies personally. If you do not manage the narrative, you forfeit control over how reality is remembered. The highest level of psychological dominance is not achieved through emotion, intimidation, or constant assertion. It emerges from systems that create automatic consequences. When others learn that respect for your time grants access, while disrespect quietly closes doors, you no longer need to negotiate boundaries in every interaction. Instead, behavior is shaped by the environment you design. In behavioral economics, this is referred to as incentive alignment. People adapt to structures more efficiently than to appeals. And when those structures are predictable, you become a stable point of reference in any network. Consider a practical example. A colleague habitually arrives late to meetings you organize. The reactive approach is confrontation, frustration, or repeated warnings which gradually erode your authority. The systemic approach is different. You begin meetings on time regardless, exclude habitual offenders from critical updates, and ensure that reliability is rewarded with influence. The system itself teaches the lesson without emotional outbursts. This is not cruelty, but efficiency. As Machiavelli observed, rulers should rely on what they can control, not on the goodwill of others. A system is within your control, another person's conscience is not. This method also protects your emotional sovereignty. When consequences are preset and automatic, you remove personal volatility from the equation. Others cannot manipulate you by provoking reactions because the rules are already embedded. They either comply or self-exclude. In this way, you preserve composure and project authority without constant performance. Over time, this reliability establishes you as someone whose respect must be earned and whose disapproval is costly. Closely tied to systems is the art of silent influence. The most powerful individuals in any social or professional sphere are rarely the loudest. They are often the observers, the ones who calculate while others react. Their power is not announced, but inferred. Silence creates ambiguity, and ambiguity creates caution. When others cannot easily read your strategy, they are forced to act conservatively around you, which inadvertently strengthens your position. Silent influence also allows for dual positioning. Like the fox and the lion, you can be adaptive without signaling adaptation. Competitors discover your moves too late to counter them. Allies benefit from your support without fully understanding your alignment, and detractors find their influence eroded without recognizing the origin of their decline. This discretion is not dishonesty, it is strategic opacity. You reveal what advances your position and conceal what would weaken it. Over time, this balance makes your power appear inevitable rather than manufactured. In modern contexts, silent influence operates across multiple layers. Online, it manifests in how you curate your digital footprint, ensuring that narratives surrounding you are coherent and aligned with your goals. Offline, it is expressed in how you control your presence in meetings, social circles, or negotiations. You speak less, but act with greater precision. Each word carries weight because it is rare. Each action resonates because it is decisive. The silence between those moments amplifies their impact. Ultimately, systems and silence converge to create an aura of inevitability. People adapt their behavior not because you demand it, but because the structure you design leaves no viable alternative. They respect you not because you remind them to, but because they recognize the costs of failing to. This is the essence of psychological authority, reducing the need for constant struggle by embedding your influence into the fabric of the environment. At the apex of psychological strategy lies a truth both liberating and daunting. If you do not master the dynamics of influence, you will inevitably be mastered by those who do. Human interaction is not neutral ground. Every exchange carries implicit negotiations of status, credibility, and control. When you rely on fairness alone, you surrender initiative. When you cultivate strategic perception, enforce systemic consequences, and operate with emotional discipline, you become the variable others must adjust to rather than the one endlessly adapting. This mastery does not mean adopting cruelty or abandoning ethics. It means recognizing that kindness without boundaries is indistinguishable from weakness in competitive environments. It means learning to frame narratives so that your story is remembered on your terms. It means understanding that the most enduring influence is often invisible, that the most dangerous individuals in any room are not those who shout, but those who quietly calculate while others reveal themselves. Power is not a declaration, it is a pattern of behavior repeated until it becomes reputation. Consider how this applies in your own life. When you give your approval freely, others take it for granted. When you enforce standards with consistency, approval becomes scarce and valuable. When you respond emotionally to attacks, you validate the attacker's control of the frame. When you respond calmly, proportionately, and decisively, you demonstrate control of yourself and, by extension, control of the situation. Over time, this consistency creates a gravitational pull. People orient themselves around you not because you demand it, but because your stability and authority make it rational to do so. The choice then is stark but empowering. You can continue operating under the assumptions you were taught, that justice is guaranteed, that good intentions speak for themselves, that likability is enough to secure respect, or you can recognize that influence is engineered. Machiavelli's lessons endure because they strip away comforting illusions and force us to confront the mechanisms that actually shape outcomes. To ignore those lessons is to remain predictable, exploitable, and ultimately invisible. To embrace them is to transform presence into power. The final message is clear. Do not confuse ruthlessness with cruelty. True ruthlessness is emotional discipline, strategic foresight, and the courage to enforce boundaries without apology. Do not confuse narrative control with dishonesty. It is the art of ensuring your strengths are visible and your setbacks are framed as resilience. Do not confuse silence with passivity. Strategic silence is the space in which authority matures and influence deepens. Your task is to stop being the pawn on someone else's board and to start playing as the strategist who designs the game. The world rewards those who understand its rules. The sooner you master them, the sooner you stop being a subject of invisible manipulation and begin shaping the conditions of your own life. That is the essence of psychological authority. The choice is yours: remain a spectator or step into the role of strategist.